What if I told you there was a comic book out there that shattered every record ever imagined? A record so big that for the past 3 decades it's never been beaten and no other comic has even come close to breaking it. This, of course, is the record for the top-selling comic book of all time, X-Men #1 from 1991, which sold 8.2 million copies. But what if I told you that this comic book almost never happened? In fact, the entire 90s X-Men, which is the most beloved X-Men era of all time, was almost not to be. And if that wasn't enough, the entire comic book industry that we know would have been drastically different than it is today. All this might have happened if it wasn't for a student that was on his way to becoming a doctor that decided to take an art class right before his graduation. Sometimes what you think you're supposed to be is not what you're meant to be. But in order to become the greatest at anything, there's many mountains that you have to overcome. From fleeing a communist country, moving to a new country where he didn't even speak the language, overcoming a near fatal accident, to finally being kicked out of his parents' house for wanting to follow his dreams of becoming a comic book artist. This is the story of Jim Lee, from a failed doctor to becoming the greatest comic book artist ever. Much like iconic superheroes in comic books like Batman dealing with his parents' death, Superman feeling alone in a strange world, or mutants never feeling truly accepted, Jim Lee's life too was full of adversities to overcome. Later, he would create the #1 selling comic book of all time, X-Men #1 in 1991, with 8.2 million copies sold, which he then used that fame to start Image Comics with a few other artists. That would snowball into him later becoming the president of DC Comics. Although it looks pretty good now, it wasn't always like this. But what if I told you one of the greatest comic book artists ever was actually on his path to becoming a doctor? So what changed in his life where he's willing to sacrifice everything that he's built up to pursue his dreams of becoming a comic book artist? Jim Lee was born in Seoul, South Korea on August 11th in 1964. But prior to him being born, his parents were living in the communist country North Korea. Most people might not realize this, but if you are caught trying to flee North Korea, they will either put you in work camps for the rest of your life or might even kill you. But this risk was worth it for Jim Lee's parents to take, so that their kids would have a better life. From an early age, Lee was fascinated by superheroes and comic books, especially the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons. He began drawing at a very young age, and his parents even paid for an art teacher to come to their house to teach him.
4 or 5, and I had a woman as a tutor, and she would teach me how to draw. And
you had
pastel.
A tutor who taught you to draw?
Yeah, I remember working oil pastels, and she said, start with a light yellow crayon, and work on with darker values and things like that.
Wow.
I still feel I use that knowledge today.
But then something happened to him that changed his life forever. At the age of 5, he was ran over by a truck and nearly died. He was playing in the street when a truck came barreling down and ran him over. Now, if this was a comic book, this would result in him maybe getting superpowers for the first time or the start of his superhero journey. But in reality, it just ended with him being in the hospital. This was the point where his parents decided to become super strict with him and overbearing, which would come into play later in his life. Shortly after this incident, they would move to the United States. They first moved to Ohio before settling in St. Louis, Missouri. When we immigrated to the US when I was 5, it was actually very reassuring and meaningful to me that Superman also existed in the United States. Lee found himself thrust into a strange place where he didn't even speak the language, but his love of comics actually helped him learn the language. From the ages of 9 to 12, he had a dream of being in the comic book industry, but as time went on in his high school years, his parents did not want him going into a risky industry. Ever since his accident, his parents became very demanding and very strict. They saw their son going down a path that would lead him nowhere. So they did the unthinkable. They threw away all of his comics. My parents tried to throw away my comics many times. They'd say, "I did you a favor," and threw them out. With his parents not wanting him to continue his dreams of becoming a comic book artist, Lee put his dreams behind him and focused on a career path that was much more reliable and secure. He decided to follow in his father's footsteps and become a doctor. He began to focus on his schoolwork and was drawing less and less. By the time he graduated high school, his path was set on becoming a doctor. He attended Princeton University for pre-med and psychology. But by his senior year in college, something happened that made him rethink his entire career path.
be more serious about my life, I never really intended to become a comic book artist. I went to college and got a degree in psychology, and I was actually a pre-med when I was there, and something just didn't gel right. My senior year, you have to write a thesis to graduate, and to ease up on my workload, I took some drawing classes. I figured, I can draw, and there's no homework or anything like that. It'll be a breeze.
If it wasn't for that art class he took to make his schoolwork load easier, he would have never gotten the spark to ignite his passion of becoming a comic book artist once again. At this point, he had graduated from pre-med and was on his way to becoming a doctor. What Lee decided to do next angered his parents so much that they kicked him out of the house.
I think they really wanted me to follow my father's footsteps as a doctor because it represented security. I looked at medicine as sort of this very long escalator that you got on and you rode it all the way to the top and you got off, and I just didn't want to get on that ride. I wanted to get a job. I wanted to work in comic books.
He decided he wanted to follow his dreams to become a comic book artist, so he told his parents he was dropping out of medical school. His parents were furious at him, and they got into many fights. They eventually even kicked him out of the house. Lee then came up with a plan, and his parents reconciled with him. So what was his plan? His plan was to take a year off and try really hard to break into the comic book industry. If he couldn't make it by 1 year's time, then he would stop and go back to his path of becoming a doctor. So in 1986, he set up a small drafting table next to his bed, and each day for 8 to 10 hours, he would work practicing his drawing. He would practice so much that he even injured his back that required a brace to let him continue to draw. Lee committed to the rule of 10,000 hours, which is a belief that if you put in 10,000 hours into something, you will become a master. By the time I got to 10,000 hours, I was on X-Men. The talent doesn't instantly get you a job. He started sending his portfolio out to every publisher he can think of. I remember my first mailing. It was 90 packages and all rejections. They're harsh, but they were pretty funny too. They said, "You can't draw hands or expressions or human anatomy." St. Louis had a very small comic community at the time. Any chance he would get, he would go to the comic shop that was near him. Through the comic shop, he befriended 2 comic book veterans, Don Secrece and Rick Burchett. Don thought Lee was very talented and gave him his first professional work, inking Samurai Santa. The 2 comic book veterans convinced him to take his portfolio to the New York Comic Con. Once in New York, he knew he had to make it as time was running out. He went to the Comic Con at the Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, where luck would have it, Marvel's editor Archie Goodwin was there.
And so I put together some artwork, and I went to a convention. I showed it to some editors at Marvel, and I got work. It took about 4 months. I was pretty fortunate.
Pretty lucky for us that you went to a Marvel editor. I mean, you might have gone to just an ordinary person.
The funny thing is that they were the only ones that gave me work. I showed it to a lot of smaller companies in DC and
That's
stuff.
why they're smaller companies.
That's right. There you go, Stan.
He loved Lee's portfolio so much that he got him in touch with editor Carl Potts. By November of 1986, he got his first official job, penciling on Marvel's Alpha Flight. He was excited, as this meant he didn't have to go back to med school. His first comic book he penciled was for Alpha Flight number 51, that came out in June of 1987. But technically, he did do an advertisement for that Alpha Flight book in Marvel Age Annual number 3 that came out 1 week before. A couple issues later, in Alpha Flight number 53, he did his first cover and his first time drawing Wolverine. During this time, a character was quickly becoming Marvel's hottest property. Can you guess who that character was? It was the Punisher. Already having his own series, Marvel wanted to capitalize on the high demand for him. So they decided to make another solo series for the Punisher. This was to be titled The Punisher War Journal. They enlisted Jim Lee to be the main artist, and it was an instant hit. By issue 4, Lee brought on a new inker, Scott Williams, which would mark the longest-lasting artistic team ever. In issue 7 and 8, Lee was drawing a guest star, Wolverine. Bob Harris, an editor at Marvel, saw it and asked him to fill in on Uncanny X-Men number 248 in 1989. By 1989, X-Men was actually Marvel's most popular franchise. But it wasn't always like this. Actually, they got canceled in issue number 66 in 1970 due to poor sales. It wasn't until they introduced the new X-Men in 1975 that they got a rebirth. Jim Lee was later brought on for X-Men 256 to 258, where he did one of his best redesigns ever. And that character was Psylocke. I mean, just look at the difference. Anyways, that proved to be very successful. and that he became a regular on the series and even co-created Gambit in issue number 266. By the end of 1989, he was making enough money to move out of his parents' house. He moved to San Diego, California, where him, Scott Williams, and Willis Porcio opened up their own studio. Their hopes were that this would elicit inspiration and friendly competition to help each other get better. The studio was called Homage Studios. It was first started out a one-bedroom apartment, but over time it began to grow. In 1991, things were going very well for Jim Lee, but he was about to do something that had never been done before and to this day still hasn't been done. He broke the record for the all-time best-selling single comic book issue. X-Men number 1 in 1991 sold over 8.2 million copies. Jim Lee redesigned all the X-Men's look, and this was the peak 90s comic boom. He became Marvel's #1 artist overnight and was a superstar. But this would be short-lived, as after issue 11, he quit the X-Men. But not only X-Men, but Marvel altogether. He left with a few other artists, most notably Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld, and started their own comic book company, Image Comics. Prior to this, these artists had to sit down with Marvel, and they were very frustrated that they had no control over the characters they created. Lee created Gambit, McFarlane Venom, and Liefeld both Cable and Deadpool, all of which were quickly becoming breakout stars. While artists did collect royalties on comics sold, they did not see any financial rights to the merchandise sold that featured their creations. The final straw for McFarlane was when Marvel produced a t-shirt with Spider-Man #1 on it, which he created, and they didn't even offer him. Marvel thought it'd be fine to lose Liefeld and McFarlane, as they saw Jim Lee as their biggest star. Lee was seen as a company man, and Marvel thought he would never leave them. But the final straw for Lee was when he asked Marvel to pay for an extra plane ticket for his wife to go to New York for a comic auction, and they said no. I made the company millions of dollars. The least they could do is spring for an extra plane ticket. With that, he left Marvel and joined the other artists to start Image Comics. On February 17th in 1992, the news broke and Marvel stock dropped to $11 a share. They started to convince other artists to jump ship and join them at Image, where the artists would own 100% of their work and each would have their own imprint within Image Comics. Lee's imprint was called Wildstorm. An imprint is basically a comic company that owns and creates a comic, but Image was more of like the publisher and the brand. So anytime Jim Lee created a comic, it was technically created through the company Wildstorm, but then Image brand and logo would be on it and they would actually publish it, meaning getting it out to the readers. Image's first books hit the shops in April of 1992 with Liefeld's Youngblood, McFarlane's Spawn, Eric Larson's Savage Dragon, and Lee's Wildcat. All those comics sold well over 1 million copies. Things were looking pretty bright for this new comic publisher and Lee's new comic company Wildstorm. With comics selling regularly in the millions for Image, it was a race for each of the imprints to get as much talent as they could. Lee's studio first started in a 1-bedroom apartment. Soon after, they got a 2-bedroom, and then an entire floor at a luxury office building near the beach in La Jolla, California. Lee didn't want to run his company so strict like his upbringing, so he made it more of a fun environment. People would often leave work midday to go surfing or hang out watching TV and playing video games. They had all their work computers hooked up so they would even have LAN parties together. One thing about Lee is he loved to throw wild parties. One time, he wanted a camel at his party, so he did. This is him riding such a camel at his own house party. Imagine, this is the 90s. Without really the internet, how would one even find a camel? I mean, they're native to, the Middle East and Africa, and he's in San Diego, California. How would you even go about getting a camel to your house? But all these parties and trying to gobble up every new talent for each of Image's imprints became its downfall. Many readers complained that Image Comics were all style and no substance. But that wasn't the biggest issue facing Image. It was the fact that they always shipped their comics late. In fact, in April of 1993, only 15% of all Image comics that month were shipped on time, compared to 90% with DC and 80% with Marvel. This caused a massive blow to Image, as comic book shops didn't want to order from them. Retailers have to order months in advance, so they don't know how much to order or if the comic will be a hit. Plus, they would have to have all their cash tied up in a comic that would arrive many months late. This caused 20% of all comic book shops that year to close down. Not only were they shipping late, but they were shipping their comics out of order too. They shipped Spawn 21 before issue 19 and 20. The worst example of this was Liefeld's Deathmate Red, that shipped 4 months late. This marked the beginning of the 90s comic crash, where many shops overordered and had thousands of unsold comics sitting around. Turmoil began internally at Image Comics. By the end of 1994, their best titles were only selling 250,000 copies each. They determined they needed to publish at least 30 comic book titles per month just to stay in business. With many of their original founders being late on their books, they had to turn to any artist they could find and publish their comics. As things became bad, some of the founders started fighting with each other. Rob Liefeld actually started in another comic book company to kind of compete with Image. It was called Maximum Press. He then went to Silvestri's imprint Top Cow and asked him to merge with his new Maximum Press comic company. Silvestri declined and rejected him, so then Liefeld decided to poach Silvestri's top talent. That caused Silvestri to leave Image, as he was a founding member of Image. So all the board members at Image got together and voted Rob Liefeld out, and Silvestri came back. Lee needed to shake off the bad reputation from what was happening at Image, so he opened a couple new sub-imprints of Wildstorm. He wanted to make comics that were writer-centered and artist-second. He brought on talent like Alan Moore, who made League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and many other comics. He even made a bid at Lucasfilms to do the new Star Wars line of comics, but lost to Dark Horse. But all this fighting at Image and declining sales of comic books made Jim Lee realize something. He didn't like running a comic book company. He wanted to get back to his roots, which was illustration. So he did something that he never thought he would do. Marvel had just filed for bankruptcy, and the industry was changing from monthly issues to more graphic novels. He didn't have the infrastructure to make the change, so in 1998, he sold Wildstorm and all of its imprints to DC. He did actually reach out to Marvel to deal with them, but thankfully it never happened, because shortly after, they filed for bankruptcy and he would have lost it all. He was just an artist once again, not worrying about the day-to-day of running a business. By 2010, Lee's career path pivoted again, when he became co-publisher of DC Comics alongside Dan DiDio. He quickly changed things up by launching the New 52 in 2011. Nearly a decade later in 2020, he had taken over the role and became sole publisher and chief creative officer for DC. As a publisher, it's all about keeping the iconic mythology alive and growing. It's weird to think about what would have happened if he listened to his parents and became a doctor. Or if he never took that art class his senior year and it didn't reignite his passion to becoming a comic book artist, which resulted in him following his dreams. How different would the comic book industry be if we never would have gotten the 90s X-Men cartoon? Would Image Comics even exist? There's so many things tied to Jim Lee and his legacy that might have never happened because he was never in the industry. It's just interesting to think how small changes can lead to huge life-changing events. Maybe there's a universe out there where they don't have their Jim Lee, but I can say that is not a universe I wish to live in.